Hey guys, welcome back. So today I'm working on this Homelite 3000 watt generator. This one was given to the channel by Stanley. He found this actually at the dump. Someone had thrown it away after, I would say, a long time of storing it quite well. This machine, I haven't quite placed the vintage on it. I'm guesstimating about 1950. From what I can tell, this two-stroke engine was actually made by Homelite during World War II. It is a Model 24A, and they sold that engine all the way up to about 1970. Anyway, this has a lot of stuff on it I'm not familiar with, so it is going to be a challenge. I did take a look for spare parts online and came up pretty much empty. Couldn't find a user manual, never mind a service manual. So I think we're on our own on this one. Anyway, I want to check for spark and compression. This is a points and condenser, so I'm sure that's going to need a bit of work. But before I pull the engine over, I think we need to deal with what's going on in that tank. It smells really bad and is varnished up pretty severely. Someone left fuel in the tank, and the tank is not in very good shape. And in the off chance that the carb is any good, I don't want to pull the engine over and suck that stuff into the carb. So I think I'm going to start there. Let's just get the tank and carb out of the way. We'll pull the engine over, check for spark and compression, and go from there. Looks like there might have been a pre-filter at one point around here, which is long gone. The filter is still usable. Gonna have to be very careful here. This tube, it is very petrified. Usually I would just cut something like that off and replace it later. In this case, I'm not so sure that's a good idea. Replacement parts, they're not existent. And also I believe there are some pickup tubes coming down from the carburetor into the tank, and I don't want to damage those either. So I'm going to try to move one of these clips down, and then we'll see if we can pry with a screwdriver to release the carburetor from this tube. Actually, that was easier than I thought. I thought I was home free with this tank, and I can't get it off. Actually, the bottom of the tank isn't the bottom of the tank. Where the carburetor goes in on the top, those tubes go down actually beyond the bottom of the tank into what looks like some sort of a bowl. And that bowl is hitting this spring. So I can't actually get the tank out. So I think the best plan of attack here might be to remove that bolt for the spring, and that should allow me to get some clearance or move that spring out of the way just a bit to allow that tank to come out. This one's probably not metric. It's also not 1/2 inch. Actually, a 15 millimeter fits pretty well. Yeah, that wasn't too bad. So I'm just going to leave the tank and the carb over here for now. We'll come back to that later. For now, let's check for spark. So before checking for spark, let's just get the plug out so that way we're not fighting compression. And we'll also get a little bit of oil in that cylinder. You know, I have no idea how long it's been since this engine was started. Plug looks decent, no rust. Champion plug J-6J. Interesting. There's a little port on the intake manifold kind of squirting out some oil. So that is most likely an impulse line of some sort for the carburetor. So this might have a diaphragm pump on it, which I'm hoping it doesn't, because I'm sure that would be shot by this point. All right, let's check for spark. The spark tester has a 1/4 inch gap. So if we have strong spark, which I doubt we do, it should be able to jump that gap. So let me kill the lights. We'll pull the engine over, see if we get any spark. All right, I think that's enough with the lights. We still have a bit of light, but hopefully we can see that a little better. So I'm going to pull the engine over. This engine spins counterclockwise, which is different from modern engines. So let's see what we get. Wow. We've got spark. How? I'm not sure. Let me just pull the engine over one more time. Make sure we have consistent spark. And we do. Let's check compression. So on a 2-stroke engine, I would expect at least 120 PSI. You know, it could be higher, but any lower, and I don't think it'll run very well. So let's pull it over a few times and see what we get. One pull, we're at 110. So that's pretty good. And actually this cord, I would say, is a little short. So it's hard to get a good pull on it. But let's try a couple more, see if we can get up to 120. Yeah, just about 120 on 2 pulls. So not bad. I think it'll run. We've got spark. We've got compression. You know, I say we add a little bit of fuel. Maybe plug a light in, see what we get. Let's give this a try. Put a little bit of fuel down the cylinder. I might squirt a little bit in here as well. You know, I had wanted to hook up a light, but these receptacles, they're not like anything I've ever seen. I don't have anything currently that'll fit in there. So for now, this will just be a test of the engine. Nice. A little smoky in here after running for about 1 second, but we've got a runner. I mean, to be honest, I thought this was going to be more of a challenge to get running. It is such an old machine. First pull, started right up. So compression, no issues. Spark, no issues. Power output, that is a TBD. You know, I do need to get some adapters so we can adapt this to something a little bit more modern. So I'm going to order those up. And I think while waiting for that to arrive, we'll just turn our attention to the tank and the carb, see if we can't save both of those. So I think I'm going to start just by cleaning a little bit of this junk off the outside of the tank. And then we'll pour out the contents, put some nuts and bolts inside, shake it around, and see what that gets us. I'm actually going to switch over to WD-40. A lot of this is just oily dirt, and WD-40 does a really good job of breaking that stuff up. This tank does not have a lip on it, which is good. It'll make cleaning it a lot easier. A lot of newer tanks have lips on it, so you can't actually pour everything out that's inside the tank. And there's a look at what came out of the tank. Definitely a good vintage. But not so much for running an engine. Anyway, we can now see the bottom of the tank, and yeah, it doesn't look great. So we're going to start simple here. We'll just add some nuts and bolts, a bit of water, shake it around, rinse and repeat. We'll do that a few times, and hopefully that'll knock a lot of that rust out of there. This is by far the worst tank I've ever done. The nuts and bolts, they're coming out just covered in mud. So I'm going to clean these off a bit and actually add some degreaser in there. I usually don't like using that because when I shake it around, it foams up and bubbles up and becomes a lot less effective as far as the nuts and bolts shaking around. But given how oily this stuff is coming out, yeah, I think we're going to need some concentrated degreaser to help break that up. Yeah, it's slow going. We are making progress, believe it or not. Yeah, I may have underestimated how bad the tank was. This is a bunch of the mud that has come out so far. And yeah, it's not good. So I'm gonna skip ahead a bit. I'm gonna work at this a bit longer and hopefully come back and show you a clean tank, but I'm not holding my breath on this one. It's pretty bad. Well, I know it's the middle of the summer, but I had to break out the snowblower. It has the perfect size wheel and it travels nice and slow. So I've got some bolts and water in the tank. Let's get the engine started and just let it run. Let's see how we're making out here. It's been 20 minutes about shaking this thing around. I did put a bit of degreaser in there because the stuff that's in there is very oily. And what I want is to try to get down to bare metal. And then we'll use a little bit of Evapo-Rust to finish it up. Yeah, not looking too good. That's after 20 minutes of tumbling on that snowblower wheel, and I really don't see any clean metal at this point. So this tank is really, really bad. By far the worst I have tried to revive. So I would say it's going to need quite a bit more time spinning to have any chance of cleaning up. So I'm going to let it run, I would say, for at least another hour. We'll check back, see if any progress has been made. It's been another 30 minutes tumbling on the snowblower. Thought I'd take a peek in here with the borescope. So right now we're looking down the length, and that is the top. You can see the sides actually have fairly clean metal, and then the bottom, which is kind of what we're trying to knock down right now. So yeah, it's getting there. It doesn't look great. It looks like we have a brass tube coming in. I believe it's from this. Not exactly sure what that is. And the deeper part of the tank, I should be looking at it right now, but I'm not seeing anything. So I think that could be an issue. You know, also that brass tube, it looks like it might have another tube connected to it running over through that baffle to the other end. So I'm not sure what that's about. Potentially it's some sort of event. Not sure. Anyway, I think the next move here is to open up the bottom. There is actually a huge bolt right there. There's a smaller one right here. You know, I'm thinking this is just full of junk, and that's why I can't see with the borescope down into here. You know, as far as that brass tube, you know, what it's doing, I'm not sure. There is a little hole right there, so yeah, maybe a vent. You know, it looks like there were some screws painted over there, so potentially I could get that out if I had to. But for now, let's just try to get this opened up. See if that gives me any insight as to what's going on down here. What do you think the odds are of this coming out? I would say not good. Oh, it turned. It's hard to say, but I think this might have been a fuel filter at one point. I see what looks like a pickup down there, possibly a screen right there, and there is a screw there. Looks like we can take this whole thing apart. So I'm actually going to bring this back outside. We'll spray this down with water, get a better look at it, and just spray in these openings here and just try to flush that junk out of there. So the good news is nothing is blocked here. I squirted water through the drain and it went into the tank and also came through a passage over to where the filter was. Now, this tank, obviously it's not going to clean up perfect, so this filter is going to be a critical component. So I'm going to try to take it apart. And yeah, that screw is already tearing itself up. So yeah, this is not going to be an optional component. I mean, the tank is not going to clean up all the way. So we need a filter. Let me stick this in the vise and maybe spray some penetrating oil on there and see if there's any chance of getting that apart in one piece. Well, I can tell you right now, I don't think any amount of PB Blaster is going to save this. That screw started to break apart, just trying to unscrew it while holding this in my hand. And of course in the vise, I can apply a lot more force, which just means it's going to fall apart that much faster. But I'm not that concerned about the screw. I mean, ultimately I want to get the filter off, get what's left of the screw out, and we can just replace it with a new. No, it's tearing it up. Guess last ditched effort. We'll try the impact and just finish the job. trying to find the bit that fits the best. Yeah, that's not going to come out. I'm going to drill it out. Try to save the filter. I think I'm going to have to give up on saving this filter. It's not letting go, and I have a feeling it's more like a cartridge, meaning this whole bobbin is kind of supposed to come out, maybe. There we go. And there we go. I was hoping it would come out in one piece. You know, that said, I think the center brass part is reusable. We'll just have to find some other screen to put on there at some point. And as far as the screw goes, let's see if we can get that to come out of there. Yep. Now, why that wouldn't come out before, don't know. But I guess the good news is we can get a new screw to put in there. We still have the top and the bobbin, so we can refit it with something, assuming we make it that far. All right, I think we're done. It's been another half hour. And in total, I'd say over an hour and a half. So at this point, I'm just going to drain it out, rinse it out with some water, and get some Evapo-Rust in there, and just let it sit for a couple days and see what that does for us. It's cleaned up pretty well, that part. All right, let's see what surprises are in here. I'm going to start by removing these two screws. They just hold on to this pipe right here that holds the air filter in place. That one was on there pretty tight. There's really not much to this carb. It looks like there's an adjustable jet right here. There is a bolt right here, which I'm assuming is where the fuel gets picked up and then drawn into the carburetor. Now, there are 3 tubes here. I'm not really sure the purpose of that. One of them has an opening. I'm assuming that's the fuel pickup. And this one, I'm not sure what's going on here. There's actually a tube that comes down. There's a U, and then it goes right back up. And this is actually the largest tube. So, yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. Haven't found any documentation on this carb. So I'm going to start just by turning this one in to see where it's set at right now. That's 1 turn, 1 1/4. That hole right there, that's where the fuel was squirting out when I was rotating the engine, not on here, but on the intake pipe. So that receives a pulse, and where it goes, I guess that is the question. And what does it do? So let's get this bolt out. Maybe that'll give a little insight as to what that is doing. And it does not look like there's a diaphragm in here. So I believe what's happening here is that the tank is being pressurized by crankcase pressure and pushing fuel up through one of these tubes. And this looks like the main jet, if I had to guess, and the needle goes down to restrict the flow. At least I think that's how that works. Let's see, what else here? There's a screw right here. Goes to a passage here over on the primer side. So let's get that out of there. And that was loose. And we got a spring. Wonder if there's a check ball in there. Let me get the light. Potentially it's a check ball. Yeah, I say we remove the primer. Feels pretty loose, like it's not actually doing anything. Might be a bad seal in there. That's pretty much it. Not much to this carburetor. And I guess the good news is it looks pretty clean. You know, this actually I think would run the engine without too much effort. You know, I think the big wild card here are these tubes. You know, how clogged are they? And of course the tank. This works together with the tank to draw the fuel. You know, I don't think it's a fuel pump. It's a pressurized tank. So if we don't have a tank, then whether this carb is good or not, it doesn't really matter because it's never going to feed fuel up. So I'm going to get out the carb cleaner, just spray through these passages, see where they go, and see if these tubes are by any chance clear. So let's start with the impulse hole right here, see where that passage leads. Yeah, and I would have to say that's clogged. We got a passage down here. Let's see where that goes. And that little hole right there, it looks like it's connecting over to the main jet. Just see if this tube is clear. And no, it is not clear at all. So, not sure what to think of that. It almost looks like there is metal there, like it's not actually a blockage. So I've been going through the carb, just kind of studying it, trying to understand how this works, and think I'm just about there. So my earlier statement about this being a pressurized tank, 100% not correct. You can see there is a through hole right there that would go down into the tank. So there is no way that this is a pressurized tank. Now, normally this would be sitting on here and capped off. This brass tube right here actually goes up to where the air filter is. And really all it is a tube. So there is a low pressure in this area as the air is coming in. And with this cap on, it creates a slight low pressure there. Now, the cap doesn't fit well, so it's not going to do a whole lot. You know, I'm sure it's just worn out, potentially, or maybe that's the way it's supposed to be. Anyway, the main way this is supposed to function is that the port right here, the crankcase from the engine is pressurizing that, and I believe it goes down to this tube right here, the one that has the hook, and then goes into this larger tube right here. And by sending basically air pressure through the big tube, it's going to force fuel up the tube, and it actually comes out here. This is just a cap, but the tube isn't capped tight. It's just almost like a dust cap. So fuel will come out of that tube. It'll fill this bowl, and anything over the height of this other brass tube down there goes back to the tank. So this is constantly filling up with fuel. The excess is returned to the tank, and there's a hole in the bottom right there, that little hole. And that goes over to the main jet, which gets sucked up into the throat of the carb, and of course it's metered with this needle. So that is mostly how this carb works. Now, I've double checked the tubes. The big tube is clear. Actually, this little tube is clear now. It was initially clogged up, and there's a check ball in there. You can just see it. That was stuck as well. So I freed that up. That is part of the primer circuit, and it actually will suck fuel up and into this compartment, which earlier I thought I saw a check ball, and I was wrong. It was actually a little needle, and that would be attached to this screw that we pulled out, just like that. And as far as I can tell, this is actually only used when priming the carburetor. So when you pump the pump, it forces fuel up this one with the check ball, it forces the needle open and sends it out this little passage here, filling up that bowl. And that's pretty much how this carb works in a nutshell. Now, I went through all the passages. They are all clear except the most important one, the one that accepts the engine pressure. This tube is clogged, and because it's bent, I can't really get in there to clear it. And I've been trying to blow carb spray and air through that hole, and it is plugged solid. Unfortunately, it also only goes in about 1/2 inch, and then it must make a turn because, yeah, it's a hard stop. So without the engine pressure making it to here, that's essentially the main mechanism that this thing draws fuel from the tank. And without that, we're in trouble. So anyway, I've gone through the carb pretty well. With the exception of that tube, I think we're good. As far as the rest of the parts go, we really only have this main jet, which wasn't clogged. So that's actually in pretty good shape. And then we have the primer mechanism itself, which seemed a little loose. There's probably some seals in here that can be replaced. Whether it still works or not, I'm not sure. But honestly, that's the least of my worries. I mean, worst case, we can just put some fuel in the bowl and the system's essentially primed. We don't need the pump to do that. So I'm going to soak this in the ultrasonic. Hopefully it fits. And I'm going to let it sit in there for a long time. Hopefully we can break up what's in here to make this carb viable. After about 5 minutes, it cleaned up really well. Unfortunately, that passage right there did not free up, so I ran it through a bunch of cycles over the course of 6 hours, and you can see it took all the paint off it. And finally, we got some carb cleaner to go through that passage, but now that it has, we have a whole different problem. Let me show you. So I'm going to spray some carb spray through that port, and just keep an eye on this third tube right here. If the tube is clear, the carb spray should go down the tube and exit into the larger tube where we see it drip out. But that's not what we're going to see here. So, did you see how that small tube is now completely soaked? There is a hairline fracture starting right at the top and running down the length of this pipe. So, yeah, it's never going to work like this. So even though I think the carb is good, the tube is bad, and it has to be replaced to have any chance of recovering this carburetor. So I guess I'm going to try to get it out. So there's a little blob of solder down there, and I'm assuming once that is removed, the tube can be removed from the carb body. I don't see anything holding it in place. I think it's just pressed in there. So I've got a torch. It's actually way oversized for this little pipe. So I'm going to start with a soldering iron, try to separate these two pipes. And assuming we can get that far, I think I might cut it in the middle. We'll remove the lower portion and then try to pull out what's left attached to that carb body. So I'm adding some new solder. hoping that it will help with the thermal transfer to get the old stuff out of there. But that is not the case because it can't even melt the new stuff once it's on here. The copper is just wicking the heat away too fast. So I think we need the torch. Much easier. And I've tried pretty nicely to persuade this to come out, and it's not budging. So I'm going to up the force a bit and apply unreasonable force. So either the tube's going to break or it's going to come out. Yay! We got pretty lucky on this one. I thought for sure I was going to break it and we'd be drilling it out. You know, instead, the tube came out cleanly. So we just need a new one of these. And it looks to be 1/8 of an inch outer diameter. And this stuff is readily available. So I'm going to order up a bunch of it because getting this 180-degree bend without kinking the line most likely it's going to take a few attempts. So we'll get some extra. We'll try to bend it into shape, get it installed, and I think we'll be all set on the carb front. So while waiting for the tubing, I think we need to change plan of attack on this tank. The Evapo-Rust, it's been in there now for just over 24 hours. And usually Evapo-Rust makes quick work of rust. Within 24 hours, you should see a very big difference. And with the amount that's in there, the Evapo-Rust should have turned dark, and we should not be able to see the bottom. So that has not happened at all. It still looks like new, and the bottom of the tank is unchanged. So I'm thinking that is not rust, at least not what's exposed right now. So I'm going to actually pour the Evapo-Rust out and try something a little bit different. You know, I have some acetone, or actually I thought I did. The can's empty, so we'll skip that for now. But that's okay, because I found some mineral spirits, which cleans up stain and varnish. And that's exactly what that stuff smells like and looks like when it first came out. So the can, well, it isn't full, so we're going to have to buy some more if it works. But for now, let's just get the Evapo-Rust out. Clearly, that's not working. We'll put what we have with the mineral spirits in, give that a little bit of time, and see if it improves things at all. It's been just over 36 hours, and it's definitely doing something. You can see it's no longer clear, and if I tilt it away, you can see what the bottom of the tank looks like. Now, it doesn't look great, but if you look kind of in the bottom of your screen, just to the right, I scraped that lightly with a screwdriver, and it got the chunks off. So, yeah, I think we are just dealing with some varnish. So I did pick up some mineral spirits, some more, so we can top it off. Also got a can of acetone, so we can give that a try if it comes to it. And I also picked up some Ultimate Paint and Varnish Remover. It seems to be quite strong. Potentially this might be what we need. But I think for now, I'm just going to drain this out, bring it back outside, put some degreaser, shake the nuts and bolts, see if we can get any more chunks out. And then, depending upon how that goes, I'll kind of make a decision here as far as do we stick with that or do we try something else. So the mineral spirits, it's working. You know, it is slow going. You know, I think it is softening the top layer, and that's what I was just able to wash out. You know, that said, looking in there, it really didn't look visually any better. So I did just pour in a bit of this paint and varnish stripper or remover, and I've got it oriented in such a way that it's mostly pooled in this corner. So I'm going to let it sit for a bit, and then we'll check in on it, see if it's having any effect. It's only been about 10 minutes, and it's actually having a pretty good effect. This stuff went in white, and you can see it's already the color of that varnish. And if I tilt the tank away, I can now see parts of the tank in that corner that I've never seen before. So I think I'm going to load up and let it sit for an hour or so. We'll dump it out and see what that gets us. Well, it's been about 2 hours, and initially, I wasn't sure I had seen a whole lot of progress. But then I just reached in there and kind of poked the bottom with the screwdriver. Didn't even have to scrape it. And a whole bunch of stuff just lifted right out with almost no effort. So I'm going to pour out the paint stripper just into a container so I can reuse it later. And then I want to get degreaser in there again. Just shake it around and see if we can get any more of that out. It's definitely a noticeable change. Let me bring it back inside where the lighting's a little better and show you what I see here. So I can actually see metal now. And if I pan as much as I can going across the tank, you see lots of bare metal, minimal rust. So yeah, this stuff's working great. So I'm going to pour it back in, let it sit for another couple hours, and I think we'll be there. So it's been another couple of hours, and it's threatening to storm outside. So let's get the goo out and try rinsing this off again and see how we're making out. It's definitely turned quite dark. It's looking pretty good. Not perfect. It needs a little bit more time, but from what I can see, I would say this is going to be usable. So I'm just going to pull the 2 bolts on the bottom here, just clean that out, flush it out, and then we'll put the goo back in, let it sit for another 2 hours. I was wrong too about what that brass tube is in there. I thought it was a tube leading up to the vent. It's actually a tube running down to this bowl right here. So when you insert the carburetor, it actually goes through that brass tube right into here. So this is sealed. There's no way for the fuel to get into the bowl except through the filter. And that also means whatever repair I do on adding a replacement tube, it needs to fit through the tube in the tank into this bowl. I was wondering how fuel got in here in the first place to then be able to advance to the bowl. I couldn't quite figure it out because when looking down here originally, I could not see inside the tank. It was just solid. And I thought that was just metal capping that off. And now it just goes right through into the tank. So yeah, I guess the idea is the fuel comes from the tank through the filter into that hole in the bottom, and then it exits out these little holes on the side, which then allow it to go over to the bowl. So yeah, the tank I would say is looking very, very viable at this point. Anyway, I am going to put the paint stripper back in for another 2 hours. It doesn't seem to be damaging the metal. It's only making things better from what I can tell. Okay, so the tank's been refilled. We'll give that another couple hours. And while waiting for that to marinate, I think I'm going to make myself a cord. I did manage to find the proper plug here. This is a Hubble twist lock. It is a 240/120 volt plug, similar to the more modern L14-30. I think the only difference is that this one does not have a ground wire. It has 2 hot wires and a neutral, which I'm assuming the neutral is the larger one, although I need to look into that because I don't know. But what I want to do is just get a cord and adapt that to a standard L14-30, We're not going to have the ground wire, but that shouldn't matter. We only need the neutral in L1 and L2, and we can use a breakout cord and make sure that this thing makes power the next time we start it up. I'm having trouble figuring out how to wire this properly into this generator. The instructions that came with this don't really make any sense. Plus, I don't know if this is wired exactly the way you would expect it to be, so I thought I would just probe with the multimeter and figure out where neutral was based on the resistance. And I'm getting some kind of erratic or unexpected readings, so I'll show you that in a minute. Also, I think I was wrong about the output of this machine. I thought it was 3,000 watts, but looking at it closer now, it looks like it says 17.4 amps at 115 and about 11 amps at 230. So this is closer to a 2,500 watt machine. And the interesting thing is that usually leg 1 and leg 2 are balanced. So if it's 17 amps at 115 volts, then the amps at 230 in this case would be half that. And it's not. It's actually a little bit higher. So that tells me most likely things are wound a little differently between leg 1 and leg 2, but still, when measuring between leg 1 and leg 2, you should get the total resistance of each of the legs, and that's not what I'm seeing. Let me show you. All right, hopefully you can see the multimeter. I've got it kind of jerry-rigged, so it's probably going to fall at some point. Anyway, I started with the 120 output just to measure the resistance to see what leg 1 comes in at. And in this case, it's 65.5 ohms. And after probing over here on these wires, the different combinations, I finally found that these two result in the same reading. And just as a double check, if I keep one lead there and one lead right there, we get a direct connection. So we know that those are essentially the same. And if I check it to any of these others, we don't get a direct connection. We get resistance higher than 0.1, 0.2. So these two are the same. And then I did the same over here just to find the terminal on this outlet that has a direct connection. In this case, it's that one right there. And these others test high resistance. So that tells us that these two terminals are leg 1 on this connector. Now, which one is neutral, we don't know. And usually what you would see is that, let's just assume this one is neutral because it has a different color screw. And we're at 65 ohms. So if I go over here, assuming this is leg 2, we should see 65 ohms. And we do see something close. And then if we connect between what I assume is leg 1 and leg 2, we should see roughly double that, around 120. And yet we don't see that. So let's assume that that was not neutral. So let's say that this is neutral. And we know we have 65 ohms between these two. So we'll check over here. And we get 68, so very similar reading. So then I would expect, if that's the neutral, that if we go between these two, again, we would see roughly double that, around 130. And we don't see that. So, yeah, this is not set up the way I would expect on a more modern generator, no surprise. And the other interesting thing I noticed is that when probing, the value seemed a little off at times. So then I rotated the engine, which I'm going to do right now. And as I rotate the engine, I'm just rotating it and stopping, the resistance values are changing. So that actually tells me that this is very different from generators I normally work on, because usually the wires on the output, they're connected to the stator. And it's the rotor in the middle that spins as an electromagnet, creating power output. But since we're getting changing resistance depending upon the position of the crankshaft, that tells me actually the power output is coming out of the rotor, the center of the machine that's spinning. So it's coming out through the brushes, and depending upon where we stop, you know, that's the resistance we get. So I'm thinking I'm going to just pull the cover off here. We'll take a look at the slip rings, probably measure directly on the slip rings, and see if that gives us any insight as to what's going on. Nope, I'm going to try the impact. It's definitely not something that I would see on a modern generator. We have 3 slip rings, so most likely leg 1 and leg 2, one of them being the neutral. And we also have something in here. You know, I'm guessing that this has to do with the excitation, but I really don't know. You know, I have not worked on a generator like this. Anyway, I can only see one of the brushes right here. That's the spring that holds the brush in. And I want to see or gain access to the others because I want to test from the wire over to these receptacles and just see which slip ring goes to which terminal. And yeah, maybe that'll help me figure this one out. Actually, while we're here, let's just check this brush and see where it connects to over on the outlet. So this is the middle slip ring. We'll start with the 120. In this terminal, we get high resistance, so it does not go there directly. And this one's pretty low, 0.1 ohms. So the middle brush or the middle slip ring feeds that right there, which I believe corresponded to that one, which it does. So let's pull the other cover and check the other slip rings. I think it's been a while since these covers are off. Maybe never. So I moved you back over on this side just so you can see where I'm probing on the outlet, and I'll tell you which slip ring I have the other probe on. All right, let's check this slip ring here, the one on the right, closest to the engine. We already know where this one goes, so let's try that. We're looking for a low resistance, in this case 31 ohms, not quite low enough. Let's check over here. And that is a direct connection. So that slip ring is this other wire that's on L2, which I'm guessing has to be L2. We're just trying to figure out now which one of these on L1 is neutral. So I'm going to move over to the outer slip ring. And the outer one should be this one, which it is. So we know for sure now where each of these slip rings go. We know that the main power output is coming over to the receptacles here. So I still have the big question though, is what is connected to what? So now that we know the outer slip ring is definitely L1, really what we're trying to do now is probe from the outer slip ring to each of these others on the terminals, trying to find actually the highest resistance connection, which means that's the other end of L2. from L1. And that means the lower connection will be the neutral, I hope. So let's check from the outer slip ring to the middle and the inner and see what we get. All right, I've got one probe on the outer slip ring terminal and the other probe on the middle terminal. And yeah, we're getting a pretty high resistance. So, I don't actually think this is a good test anyway, because these terminals, they are dirty and we're still testing through the slip ring. So it's really no different than what we did out here. So I might be overthinking this. Once the generator's running, we can easily find out which one is the neutral. So I'm going to wire these two up as leg 1, which we know as a fact. And we know this wire goes to leg 2. We just don't know which one of these wires is the neutral. So if I wire it wrong on leg 2, we're actually going to see 240 instead of 120. And that's an easy test to do with the multimeter once it's running. So we won't plug anything electrical in until we can validate that this is correct. But I think for now, that is probably the path of least resistance. So before I put this cover back on, I'm going to clean these slip rings a bit. They actually don't look too bad. And we'll just put the cover back on and move on. So I just spent a bunch of time cleaning up these main slip rings here, and I thought I would double check the ohms, and now we see something quite a bit different. We were getting kind of in the 60 to 130 ohm range when testing leg 1 and leg 2. The readings were inconsistent based on how the brushes were contacting the slip rings, and now that they're clean, we see a much better reading. On newer generators, I usually test and get about 0.3, 0.4 ohms. So now testing leg 1, we're getting 0.4 ohms, 0.3, 0.4. So that's actually in line with what I'd expect. So now if I go back to here and test the same leg, we should be at same reading, 0.3, 0.4. There we go. Now, on leg 2, if I'm measuring from the neutral to leg 2 and the neutral from leg 1, I would expect about the same reading. And that's what we see. About 3 or 4 ohms. So then if I probe from leg 1 to leg 2, we should see double that. And we do. So that's the neutral, that's leg 1, that's leg 2. It's hard to make wiring look exciting, so I'm not sure I'm going to try, but I've already done a lot of prep work here. I've stripped back the outer insulation, and the important thing here is to be careful. After you strip this back, look over these conductors carefully. Make sure you didn't nick any of the wires, and if you did, just chop it off and start over, which I did have to do on this one. The other thing is you want to get the length right. You want to clamp down on this wire here that has the outer insulation in place. And then these wires need to be long enough to reach what you're trying to do without being too long. You know, in this case, I think we're going to be okay. I guess we'll find out in a minute. And again, if you're too short, you need to strip stuff back a little more. Too long, that's easy. Just cut off the extra. And in this case, we're going to have a neutral and 2 live wires. Now, green is not a good color for a live wire. Usually you would do black and red or black and black, at least in the US. So I'm just going to get a Sharpie. We'll color that black to give someone a clue that this isn't actually a ground. You know, that said, this is just for testing. I don't think anyone else is going to ever use this except me, so it should be good. But still, we'll be safe rather than sorry. Just going to check the length first. Yeah, that should be fine. Do 2 more like that. I'm sure that's up to code. And then just connect it. Taking care that these strands go all the way in. You don't want strands poking out. That could short with something else. And the thing that really threw me on this connector too, if you look at this standard L13-30, you know, I can tell by looking at it, because I've used these so much, is that the one with this bend here, that's the ground, opposite's neutral, then we got leg 1 and leg 2. Doesn't matter where the live wires go, whether it's here or here for leg 1, leg 2, or the other way around. You just don't want to put it on a neutral and a ground. And if you look at the terminals, you know, ground is green, you go to the other side, neutral is white, and then the live wires are this copper color here. And on the new connector, what we found is that this one is the neutral, and that is the gold color. So you would think the other two, which are the lives, would be the same color, but they're not. We have this brass color versus a copper color, which is leg 1 and leg 2. So yeah, not as intuitive as this one. And it's possible, too, that this generator is just so old that it's not following current standards for this type of plug. Anyway, let's get the neutral on first. That's just snugged down for now. We'll tighten it up in a bit. And most of these connectors have some sort of way to align these two pieces. And in this one, we have a little notch right there, which corresponds with that one right there. So if you line those up, they go right together. Should be good. And similar process over here. So we got to loosen up this clamp. Get this on first. You don't want to connect the other side and then realize you didn't do this, because then you got to do it all over again. And by doing this, it's going to allow me to use standard plugs, including my breakout cord, which takes the neutral, shares it between two 120 outlets, and then one leg goes to one outlet, the other leg to the other, so we get 120 volts on each leg. If you want the full 240, then you would go between the legs, because when one leg is positive 120, the other one's a negative, and the net effect is you get 240. Great. And similar to the other one, we have a tab right here, and it should correspond to a tab right there. Let's do a quick reality check, make sure I wired it properly, or at least the way I intended. So we'll start just by putting the multimeter into ohms. We're going to measure from neutral on one to neutral on the other. The connection should be a very low resistance connection. In this case, 0.1, 0.2. That's fine. Just check the other conductors, make sure there's no stray connections, and there's not. So now we'll check one of the legs. Nice low resistance connection, 0.1, 0.2. No stray connection anywhere else, so we're good there. And then we'll check the other leg. 0.2, 0.1, perfect. Yeah. We're good. It's the next day, and I did pull the paint stripper out of there. I put Evapo-Rust in overnight to finish the job. So everything's rinsed out, the nuts and bolts are out. Let's take a look at the final result here. Yeah, that's pretty impressive. That's looking the length of the tank. We'll just pan it a bit. So that's the bottom. If you remember that from before, it was a complete disaster. And of course the top looks good. Let's just pan around a little more. There's the brass tube going down actually into the bowl. And yeah, it's amazing. I mean, this tank, you would never know what it looked like a few days ago. So, yeah, I would say that is a pass. We are done with the tank, with the exception of the filter. I've got a few ideas for that. Let me show you what I came up with. So the original filter fit in like that. You know, it went down into the tank. There was a bolt holding it down, and the fuel would enter through the screen, and then the filtered or the screened fuel would go through the bottom and exit on these holes on the side, where then it could advance to the bowl. So I was thinking initially of repairing this one, finding a screen that would fit, getting a new bolt, and I already hit an obstacle because the bolt that I cut was kind of a specialty fastener. It was a very high thread count. No hardware stores actually have it in stock. You know, I'm sure I could order it, but then we still have the issue of finding kind of the perfect screen to fit on there. So I'm going to save that part, but I think I have another idea that might work just as well. And initially I was thinking like a chainsaw filter. If this could go in that hole in the bottom, then we'd essentially have the same thing. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit. And I've tried a few different types, and none of them quite are going to work out. So then I got to thinking, a generator, like a generator you buy today in the store, uses a filter that goes into the tank. And this is just the standard Honda clone filter that you would see on something kind of like this. So I took that filter off, and it actually only came with this washer, and was trying to find some way to get that to stay, because that would essentially do the same as the original. So what I came up with was actually a rubber bushing that replaces this O-ring, and it's a nice snug fit, so nothing's going to sneak by it. And if I bring that down to the bottom, and it's also a nice tight fit on the outer diameter. So assuming I can actually get it down in there, I think it's going to be quite effective. And then this filter, it's a common, very common filter. So whoever ends up with this is going to have no issues in the future, finding a replacement for it. So yeah, let's try to get that pushed in there. See what that gives us. I think that'll do. It's a nice tight fit, makes a good seal, and it's going to filter the fuel. A little crooked, but you know what? It's not going to hurt a thing. So we'll actually add the washer back and just snug that down. So the copper tube showed up. That should, in theory, have fixed this carburetor. That said, I found a few problems. The first thing is that the copper is so soft that most of the time when I pinch it, it kinks the line off. This one actually I think is one of the few attempts that I believe is still passable, meaning it allows air through it. The more important problem is the fact that although this was advertised as 1/8 of an inch outer diameter, it's actually not. It fits in there quite loose. There's a lot of slop. And when I double checked the dimension with the caliper, we should be at 0.125 inches if this is 1/8 of an inch, and instead we're at 0.1165. So yeah, that's not gonna work. So instead, I was able to locate some brass tubes. These are also advertised as 1/8 of an inch. And I would say they are, because these actually don't fit in the hole, but it's really, really close. Like it actually holds the tube in place, but I can't push it down to where it needs to go. It needs to go about 1/4 inch down. So I took this one and sanded it just for a second. Well, actually, probably more like a minute. And now it is going in a little bit further. So I think with a little bit of work, we can get it to fit about 1/4 inch down and have it snug in the hole. And I also tested making a bend here. I actually didn't think it was going to work out, but it seems like it did. It did not kink. This test bend might actually be usable. So we'll keep this kind of in our back pocket as a backup. I do have this other tube, which I'm going to show you the process that I went through to make that bend and hopefully get this installed. We do need to cut it to length once the bend is there, sand it, and get it to fit in there properly. But before we do that, I am curious how this fuel pump works. Every fuel pump I've worked on uses a diaphragm, which always goes bad, especially with the ethanol fuel. So I'm just going to use this cup of water. We use the straw to simulate the big tube on the carburetor. And we have the hook down on the bottom. We'll just send some air through the brass tube and see if we get any water to come out of there. Yeah. It works pretty well. It's like a percolator, an old coffee pot. So pretty ingenious design, and I guess that explains why there's a cap on the big tube. It's to keep it from forming a geyser and just shooting out the carburetor. It directs it back down into the bowl. So yeah, pretty good design, actually. I'm surprised this isn't used more often. You know, it's better than a gravity-fed system because gravity-fed systems rely on the needle and seat to function properly, or else you end up flooding the engine, spilling fuel on the floor, or filling the crankcase up with fuel. And a design like this should theoretically last forever. In this case, it lasted 70 years. And I think the only reason it failed is because someone left fuel in there for several decades, and it eventually wore down the brass. Anyway, let's get this one bent into shape and see if we can't finish up this carb. Initially, I'd bought this bender to make the bend we need on the pipe, and although it works fine, the problem is it can't make a tight bend like we need in this case. So instead, I'm going to use this bolt. I chucked it into the drill, turned it on, and held the cutoff wheel there to make a channel similar to what this tool has. So that'll help support the pipe as we make the bend. But before we do that, there's a few things we need to do here. I want to actually sand this end and find out exactly what the diameter is that's needed to fit into this carburetor. We'll need that measurement for later. And then once we have that, I'm going to heat up the pipe where we're going to make the bend. You know, this might be hardened, so that will soften the metal. We'll make the bend, and if it all works out, we'll then sand the pipe to the same diameter that we found earlier and make the cut, and with any luck, get this installed properly. Yeah, it's pretty good. That's about 1/4 of an inch. So let's see what diameter that is. Let's double check what we have here. And on the unsanded portion of the pipe, it's 0.1255, so just a touch over. And where we sanded, which is actually on this end, we're exactly 0.125, or 1/8 of an inch. So that is good to know. Next, I'm going to heat up the pipe on this end. Most likely this is hardened, and by heating the pipe and letting it cool naturally, it's going to make it a little bit more flexible. So once it cools enough where I can hold it, I will bend it around the bolt, and hopefully we get something that's at least as good as the test, if not better. It's still quite warm, but I think it's cool enough to give this a try. Now I'm going to leave it a little long. We'll cut off the extra when we're done. Okay, these look about the same. I'm not sure if one is any better than the other. You know, this is the one I just made here. So let's proceed with this one. And I think the next move here is just to cut the pipe right about there to make that J, and then find out where we need to cut it. And before doing that, we'll chuck it up, sand it down like we did over here, so that hopefully once we make the cut, it'll just slide together and we'll be in pretty good shape. Very carefully put this in here. We don't want to crush the pipe. Should be good enough. And I'm going to use a Dremel to cut this off. It's not the best tool. You might be better off using a pipe cutter of some sort like this, which I could use over here. But since this is folded, I can't really do that. So we'll just go careful. It is going to make some burrs, so we'll have to clean that up after. And if I just take the tube and put it through the fuel return, I can actually bring it all the way through the carb body, put it in the large pipe right there, and mark roughly where I need to sand that pipe. Something like that. I think we're there. I'm just marking roughly, again, where it goes into the carb body. And I'm going to add about 1/3 of an inch to that mark. That's where I'm going to cut it. So the big question is, does it fit? And it does. It's a pretty snug fit. It goes right in the big tube. So that should run as is. And I guess the one thing I want to do before finalizing this is secure the pipe to the center one, kind of like the old one was. So I could put a bend somewhere in here to get it closer, and then we can add some solder and attach it. You know, but I'm thinking we actually could use just an extra piece of pipe as a bridge. We'll use some solder to firm it all up. But before we do that, let's just drop this in the tank and make sure this extra width isn't going to be an issue with the tube going down to the bowl. Perfect. Pipe removed. All right, that was a fail. Try this again, except a little further up this time. The space was just a little too big and that tube fell through. while trying to attach it. To be honest, I wasn't sure we were going to make it to this point. Wasn't sure the carb was repairable. I was fairly confident the tank was a total loss. And of course, without any parts available, the options weren't looking too good. Yet, here we are. This carb, I think, is viable at this point. And so is the tank. So we'll just get this together, starting with the main jet, which feels a little snug, a little too snug, but it is going in. And we'll put the needle in. We'll turn this down lightly until it seats on the main jet. You don't want to crank down on this because you can actually bend and distort that tip on the needle. So once it's lightly seated, we're going to turn it back out. So we're seated right now, and we were roughly 1 1/4 turns out, which is right there. We can fine tune it later. And now we just have the primer circuit. We have this spring with the needle reattached, which goes right in there. And just snug it up. And then the primer itself. Now the primer, I did not take it apart. I don't know if it works. I guess we'll find out in a minute. To be honest, though, I'm not that concerned. Now that we know how this carb works, we can just fill the bowl. That's essentially the same thing as priming it. All right, let's try it out. Just getting a little bit anxious, but I do want to put this intake on as well, since it has that splash guard right there. Last but not least, we need to mix up some two-stroke fuel. So the machine calls for a 10-to-1 mix. Of course, that's not using modern oil. It calls for 30 weight oil at a 10-to-1 ratio. So for now, I'm going to test with that ratio using SAE 30 oil. Later I can experiment, maybe try a 25-to-1 or 32-to-1, but this machine has lasted 30 years and there's really no data on what modern oil can do as far as protection. So we'll stick with the original recipe. And to that end, I'm not going to mix up a full gallon. I'm going to mix up about a liter of fuel. That's about a quarter of a gallon, which should be more than enough for testing. So the oil level, I'll just bring it right below 100, fill the rest with fuel, and throw it in the tank. This cap's pretty cool. It has the instructions for mixing the fuel and the oil, and it also doubles as a measuring device. So it says 6 of these full of oil with 1 tank of fuel. Mix it well, and you're good to go. So what do you think? Is it going to run? Well, I know it will because we tested it earlier. I think the bigger question is, will it stay running? Is that fuel pump repaired enough? So that's what we're going to find out. As far as the primer goes, I did try it, and we're not getting any fuel to the bowl. So I'm just going to fill the bowl manually. That should be enough to get it going. And once it's running, hopefully the pump takes over and the engine keeps running. And assuming it does, we can take a look at the output. I've got the breakout cord connected. I've got 1 light plugged into each leg. These lights are turned off because this generator most definitely relies on residual magnetism. There are no permanent magnets on the rotor, and being that it hasn't been run in such a long time, that could be an issue. If all magnetism's lost, we're not going to get any power output, and starting it with a load on it will stress it to the point where it may not power up. So those will stay off. Assuming we have output, I'll turn them on, see that we get output from both legs, and we'll go from there. I think I'll stand out here for a few minutes. The carbon monoxide detector, it's not happy. I've got to say, I'm impressed. This thing started right up. And granted, it was struggling at first. I wasn't sure if it was a fuel pump issue, but it ended up being a jetting issue. So I opened up that needle about a half a turn to let more fuel into the engine. And at that point, the engine speed, it increased and stabilized. So I turned my attention to the output side of things. And according to the multimeter, we were at 125 volts, almost exactly 60 hertz. And both lights turned on without issue. So that confirms that leg 1 and leg 2, they are functioning. All the wiring that was done here is correct. And I was going to put a 1500 watt load on next and had to cut that short when the carbon monoxide detector started alerting me of a problem. So that, I guess, is a good lesson. Don't run engines inside. And if you do, take the proper precautions. Only do it for a very short time. Have multiple carbon monoxide detectors. Have a fire extinguisher, and never leave it unattended, because you could burn your house down, or if you're not paying attention, you could poison yourself with carbon monoxide. And by the time you realize what's going on, it's too late. So let's get this outside. We'll get it started again and put her to work. All right, pretty much ready to go. I've got 2 space heaters on standby. They are 1500 watts each on high. On low, they're only 500 watts. So the plan is just to start the engine. We'll let it warm up a bit. We'll double check the outputs. We've got the kilowatt to measure the hertz and the volts, the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion, and we have the oscilloscope so we can actually see what the output looks like. Once it warms up, we will put a load on the machine starting at 500 or maybe 1,000 watts. We'll double check the outputs, and if things look good, we'll bump it up a little bit more. I mean, when new, this could do 2,500 watts. Can it do it now? I don't know. And honestly, I don't think I'm going to test that, because at this point, at 70 years old, this is more a showpiece, a museum piece, than something people are going to rely on for 2,500 watts. So I'm not overly concerned about the max rated load. Anyway, before getting it started, I do want to get that air filter back installed. Most likely we'll have to adjust the jetting because the filter will richen up the mix a little bit. And even before that, the primer is something I might want to tackle, because I was looking for parts for this. I was looking everywhere for a parts diagram. Didn't find one. Instead, I found a lot of Homelite chainsaw parts for vintage chainsaws. And one of the parts looked like the part I needed, the primer pump. So I got it on eBay. It was dirt cheap. Looks to be the right part. And it is new old stock. So maybe it'll work. So let's try getting that installed first. We'll test it out, get the airbox on, and give this thing a start. They look pretty similar, if not identical. So I'm just moving the washer over to the new pump. See if it threads in, which it does. Yeah, seems to fit. So the question is, will it send fuel up? Yep. Can you see it? Probably not. Let me get you in there closer. It's nearly impossible to get this shot. Hopefully you can see. I'm just going to pump it a few times. Yep. Yeah, I think you can see that. It's kind of squirting out the top and down the side. So I would say the primer's fixed. Well, I've got to say, I am impressed. This machine, it surprised me too. For something so old, I just expected the output to be dirty, and I saw the complete opposite. Without a load, we were at 2% harmonic distortion, sine wave looked great, and under a 2000 watt load, things continued to look good. The distortion only went up to 4%, sine wave looked great, and then we had a problem. The engine sounded like it was going to stall under the 2000 watt load, so I took the load off, and the engine continued to run bad. But what I noticed is when I worked the primer, things smoothed out quite a bit. So I think something did get clogged up. I took a look in that tank, and the fuel looks quite dirty. So although I cleaned the tank pretty well, there was still a bit of debris in the corners. And I think the engine running, just shaking things around, may have broken off those last bits of debris, and now the fuel system is clogged, or at least partially clogged. So let's get this back inside. I wanted to drain the tank anyway for storage, so we'll take a look at that fuel, maybe give the tank a quick clean, and call it done. All right, let's see how bad this is. I'm just going to swish it around a bit. I really just want to get any loose bits out. That's amazing. Considering the tank was almost spotless, by the time I was done cleaning it, that fuel picked up a lot of sediment. So most likely this is going to have to be done a few times. Well, let's take a quick peek in there with the camera. All right, let's take a look in the tank. And we're looking down the length of the tank. It looks pretty good. I'll rotate to the left. See a little bit of debris there on the bottom. And there's the fuel filter we installed. And there's a bunch of debris right there behind that brass pipe. So that was actually the pile of debris I was thinking about. And it doesn't look like it broke up. It is still there. So what I'm thinking happened is that the debris came from here. Although the outside of this cleaned up really well, the inside didn't. You can see some of the debris right there. Surprisingly, though, when I rotate this, the majority of it is now clean. So that, I would say, is the source of the contamination. And unfortunately, this is going to have to be done a few times, I think. But we are a step closer. Anyway, let's pull out the fuel filter and the nut from the bowl and just see if there's any chunks in there. It looks like the repaired tube is holding up, which is a good thing. So I don't think we have any serious problems here. Yeah, it doesn't look bad. So I wonder if fuel just wasn't making it down to the bowl. Bowl is empty and looks fairly clean. And this bushing did blow out a little bit. You can see there is some debris that was caught by the screen. Nothing obvious though. Although one thing I may have overlooked, if you look at this filter, the filter element doesn't start until right there. So that's a good 1/2 inch of fuel on the bottom of the tank that'll never get drawn down into the bowl. So it may have just been a case of not enough fuel in the tank and a bunch of junk. Well, guys, that's pretty much a wrap. Against all odds, the 70-year-old machine came back to life. The generator made power. And not only that, but the power output was clean. And it could pull 2,000 watts without issue. And I have no doubt we could have gotten to the rated 2,500 watts if we had not run into fuel problems. So, yeah, the tank, that was really the hard part of getting this machine running. It was a total mess. Of course, the carb needed a little bit of help as well. So I'd say we're about 95% of the way there. It needs to be cleaned a few more times. I'm not going to torture you with that. You've already seen that quite a bit over the last 2 hours. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.